Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Eva Arithwala, and I'm the Alumni Engagement Officer for the CSE. I welcome you all today for today's CSE Development and Action webinar on Mind the Borders, Governing Borderless Climate Risk. This webinar will address the CSE development theme of strengthening resilience and response to crisis. Presenting this webinar, we have with us today Commonwealth Alumnus Martin Munene. Martin is the founder and director for the Africa Development Resources and Capacities Institute. He is currently completing his PhD research at the London School of Economics and Political Science in the Grantham Research on Climate Change and the Environment. Martin has over 10 years of professional experience in diverse fields, and today in his webinar, he will present on his doctoral research examining transboundary climate risk and adaptation governance in his home country, Kenya. I'm pleased to inform you that Martin is a 2014 Commonwealth Shared Scholar. He completed his MSc in Disasters, Adaptation and Development at the King's College, London. A warm welcome to Martin, and we look forward to hearing more about his expertise on this webinar topic in this webinar. Welcome, Martin, and over to you.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Eva, for that kind introduction, and welcome everyone. Hello from wherever you are tuning in. And yeah, I'm excited to be speaking to us today about transboundary climate risks and how to govern them. And so this is the title, and I am told that this is the second webinar of the relaunched Development in Action webinar series. So today we're going to talk about, what are we going to talk about today? The outline, background and introduction to this subject. I'm going also to look at what they actually are, these transboundary climate risks. I was thinking of looking at the IPCC, but there is no time. So I'll just mention something about it and then a little bit about the transboundary climate risks in the Paris Agreement, and then before delving into the Kenyan context. Now, we have already heard about me, so I will not go much deeper into this, but only to highlight that my PhD is funded by Grantham Research Institute on Climate Change and the Environment, and the topic is transboundary climate risk and governance. And before that, I was working with the Stockholm Environment Institute in Thailand, the Asia Center, based in Bangkok, and then later on in the Africa Center based in Nairobi. And as you've heard, founded the Africa Development Resources and Capacities Institute, where I continue to provide my insights as a research fellow and director. My expertise, of course, I'm saying this so that we may be able to see where I'm coming from, or my arguments, what they are founded on. My interests are in sustainable development, conflict resolution and peace building, as well as disaster risk reduction and climate change. That is on adaptation, but also on mitigation, especially focusing on energy, renewable energy and energy efficiency. And in all these fields, what I have been very interested in, or what I have focused on so far today, up to date, is the research and assessment side of them, the policy, politics and governance, as well as designing, monitoring and evaluating some of these projects in these particular areas. My work focuses on, as you can imagine, cuts across many sustainable development goals. But for today, the topic addresses climate action, which is SDG number 13, as well as SDG 17, which is partnerships for the goals. But as you will probably know already, climate change is an issue that cuts across all these SDGs. And as we continue talking, you might be able to see how this actually happens. So yes, so today we are talking about a subject that is critical, a subject that I have dedicated my life, my academic life for the last 4 years to studying. But why is it important? Why do I think that this is necessary? First, I think three things. One, the nature of climate risks themselves, the climate-related hazards. They are borderless and that they do not really respect any sort of political boundaries or any sort of boundaries for that matter. The way they are propagated, the way they travel, the impacts, a flood doesn't come and stop at a particular border. They don't require visas to travel. The second thing is that the consequences and the nature of interventions are also borderless. In addition, their design and implementation have a striking resemblance with the ones that led to the climate change problem in the first place. And the impacts, whether positive or negative, can be felt beyond where these projects or initiatives are implemented. And that dimension or that factor is the nature of our very world, that we are living a globalization where we are so interconnected in the way we produce, the way we consume goods and services, labor, capital, movement of people. So, such that an impact, a little or any impact in one dimension or in one part of the world can be propagated and be felt in other parts of the world. So those are the three things or three factors that are pertinent or that have motivated me to look into this. And also, I am not alone. So there has been increasing concern. So there are increasing concerns or growing concern, not the least amongst scholars, but also amongst policymakers and practitioners. And some citizens as well have noticed this. But I would like to see more citizens being concerned and engaged in this subject. And I think this is why we are here today. And this concern has led to the, increased search for alternatives, increased search for alternatives in terms of governance, alternatives, ways of doing things to ensure that we do not from one particular area or jurisdiction to another. And therefore, with this webinar, I hope to achieve three objectives. The first one being to unpack the transboundariness of climate risks and response measures. The second is to increase awareness of these transboundary climate risks. And finally, to promote the thinking around the governance of transboundary climate risks. As I am aware, many of you are involved in some form of governance of climate risks, either through development, through risk management, through implementing initiatives, or even policy development and advice. So these are the three objectives. So we're delving into the subject now and asking ourselves, what are these transboundary climate risks that we are talking about? Now, you might know that, before we start talking about something, it's important to know what it is. And in the academy, some people come up with various forms of, definitions. And these two that I am highlighting here are part of that raft of definitions. And just like many others, these two definitions highlight the focus, that the focus is on countries. The first definition here talks about when crisis or life-threatening or when a crisis is threatening life-sustaining systems or critical infrastructures of multiple member states, therefore bringing about the dimension of countries. And the second, which is a more recent form of definition of transboundary climate risks, is any climate risk that crosses national borders. Again, you see there is the element of national borders. But I think that this kind of conceptualization is useful but not complete, and this is why I think so. So if transboundariness or any transboundary phenomenon is a factor of boundaries, then it only means that we can say that, well, depending on what boundary we are talking, we can refer to a particular issue as transboundary, but boundaries may differ. Boundaries may be of different types, as there are. There are national boundaries, there are subnational boundaries, there are academic, disciplinary boundaries, generational boundaries, and so on and so forth, even sectoral boundaries. So there are many types of boundaries, not just national boundaries. So we can't assume that the national boundaries are the only ones that exist, unless we naively hold that countries and national governments are the only relevant actors in climate governance, which is not the case. So how am I conceptualizing the understanding of transboundary climate risks, or how do I suggest that we move forward in our understanding of transboundary climate risks? And I draw from the thinking in disaster studies and risk studies, where risk is a factor, or risk is considered as a factor of hazards, which are basically, the events that are potentially harmful, and vulnerability. So when these particular hazards meet vulnerable people, then they cause they cause harm to them because they are vulnerable, and then they are exposed to this particular problem. So on one hand, risk is a factor of hazards, vulnerability, and exposure, but this is not the only thing. So risk, how harmful a particular hazard is defined by the people's or the system's capacity to cope. So the risk is inversely proportional or related to the coping capacity. So this is how I suggest that we view the transboundary climate risk. So what we need to do is just add transboundary here. So any transboundary risk can be defined by the transboundariness of either a hazard, whether the hazard comes from a different domain, the vulnerability, where the aspects of vulnerability are defined or influenced by a non-local context, and if exposure indeed if a particular system is exposed to non-local risks or non-local hazards or vulnerability dimensions. And lastly, if coping capacity comes from or is affected by factors that are beyond the system in question, or the people in question, or the country in question, or whatever domain, a border domain we are talking about. So this is how we conceptualize. So if this has any of these elements has a transboundary dimension, then the climate risks themselves become transboundary in nature. So spend a couple of minutes looking at the transboundary climate risks in the Paris Agreement. So you remember in 2015, the global community sat down in Paris or Paris, as some people would like to say, and adopted this landmark climate change treaty, which is called, Paris Agreement. And this is what is guiding global policy making and interventions in the currently and through in the near future. So it's important to understand how it conceptualizes transboundary climate risks. So I don't have a lot of time to go into this, but there is a paper we are developing that is coming up soon, which looks into this, and you can Google it, or we can notify you when it is published for more details. But I want to highlight that the Paris Agreement is vague about what amounts to climate risks, which is interesting because you'd think that part of the first order of business in developing such a crisis management plan, which the Paris Agreement is, it would be to clearly define what amounts to a crisis and the relevant thresholds for determining action. But perhaps it uses the definitions of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. However, perhaps the nearest it comes to defining what climate risk is by using terms such as adverse effects, adverse impacts, urgent threat, and highlighting climate change as or describing it as a common concern. Now, the agreement itself acknowledges the impact of response measures, as we spoke earlier, that the response measures will also have an impact, either positive or negative. Acknowledges the multi-level dimension of response, such as adaptation, as seen in article number 7, which is the article that defines the global goal on adaptation. And as expected, there is a lot of governance talk in the Paris Agreement. As a governance instrument, there is a lot of this governance talk. And this governance talk sort of highlights several boundaries, which or boundary dimensions, which we will look at now. Now, in the articulation and implementation of the Paris Agreement, there is a lot of focus on countries and what countries can do or should do. So there is a lot of state centrism in the Paris Agreement, where it sort of conceptualizes action at these particular levels: international, regional, national, subnational. But the locus of whatever action is on the states. This is sort of expected because Paris Agreement is a treaty of states. But it also has a sectoral kind of approach in its articulation. So the various, sectors such as sustainable development, poverty eradication on one hand, mitigation on the other hand, and adaptation on the other hand. These are considered as interrelated. So the Paris Agreement sort of acknowledges this cross-border nature of this particular, or the interdependent nature of these sectors, and conceptualizes mitigation as sustainable development and vice versa, as well as sustainable development as adaptation and vice versa. But as always, there has been a clear distinction between mitigation and adaptation. Now, temporality, which is the other third dimension, the third dimension of boundary dimension in the Paris Agreement, this talks about time. It's a question of timing and time. So a lot of issues and elements and aspects such as loss and damage, intergenerational equity, sustainable development, and even mitigation are time relevant aspects, and this is very clear in the Paris Agreement. And then the third is the ecosystem dimension, which sort of looks at adaptation or climate action within the various ecosystems. Of course, because climate change has different affects various ecosystems differently, and the interdependence of these ecosystems is quite clear in practice as well as in scholarly terms. And then how these come together through what I'm calling a bridge. These are the norms and the principles which tie all these boundaries together, such that when climate action is being done, we have to consider these particular things, regardless of where you are implementing them, at what level, and the approach you are using. Factors such as, norms such as environmental integrity, development, poverty eradication, gender equality, human rights, equity, and so on and so forth. These are some of the bridging elements in the Paris Agreement. And for a clearer visualization, this is how they look. So this legal political dimension, which is also state-centric, talks about where or who is doing what in climate change. And then the sectoral, the temporal, ecological boundary dimensions actually talk about what or how climate governance is done. But also there's an element of when we are discussing, by what is the timelines that we are using to discuss these elements. And then the bridging elements here look like that. So I will not discuss so much on this, just highlighting that the Paris Agreement governs adaptation through various ways. And the first is collective goal setting, deciding what the goal for climate action is. And the second is facilitating in terms of providing support and providing support to different countries and stakeholders. And that element is information disclosure and provision through the various reporting mechanisms that it has developed, as well as signaling or encouragement, peer accountability, as well as naming. Although I must note that there is no shaming in the Paris Agreement, because different countries have their own nationally determined contributions, and this is what is used as the basis for evaluation. So you can only be ashamed if you haven't you haven't done what you said you would do in your nationally determined contribution. A few boundary spanning elements. These are things which are within the design of the Paris Agreement, which sort of help in crossing the various boundaries that we have highlighted before. And I will not go very deep in this or deeper in this, and you can look them up. There is a lot of discussion about this in the literature, as well as in the UNFCCC website. So the first one is the Enhanced Transparency Framework for Action, the Global Stocktake, where the countries come together to see the progress, to evaluate the progress globally, and the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, which has been incorporated in the Paris Agreement, the international support programs and processes, and these include financing, which is articulated in Article 9, technology development and transfer, and Article 10, as well as capacity building and cooperation in Articles 11 and 12, respectively. And then, of course, there are subsidiary bodies, which is the subsidiary body for implementation, SBI, and the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice, which are the two permanent subsidiary bodies under the UNFCCC that have been incorporated in the Paris Agreement. And finally, the Forum on the Impact of the Implementation of Response Measures. This is a forum that was established under COP17, but is now also serving the Paris Agreement. Now, its role, and this is, I think, the last thing I'll say about Paris Agreement in the with regards to climate change, transboundary climate risks, is that it acts as a catalyst for investments and resources, as well as mobilizing of ambition and effort to govern or to deal with climate change, both on the emissions side, but also on the adaptation side. And that element is that it, it plays a role for sparking the development of new and review of existing policies and strategies, but also facilitating cross-level policy diffusion from the international, the national, subnational level, and the levels in between. And the fifth thing, sorry, is the treaty effect, that this is itself being a treaty of countries. It creates cross-border responsibilities and obligations amongst nations. And finally, it is a continued platform. It's a platform for continued dialogue and scrutiny regarding climate action, amongst countries, but also other non-state actors. So now I want us to go to the Kenya context to see how the things are on the ground, if you will. So for those who don't know where Kenya is this red country here. This red country is called Kenya. It's in Africa, eastern part of Africa. The core hazards that have been highlighted by their plans are hydrometeorological in nature. Either they are related to a lot of water or lack of it, droughts and floods, storms, sea level rises, and so on and so forth. But there are also desertification, landslides, pests and diseases, which have been observed over time. And then, therefore, the risks that are associated with these are explicit and are identified as related to water, food insecurity, conflicts and instability, and amongst others. So we see hazards on one side, but also the risks that come or emanate from these hazards on the other side. Now, Kenya, being this country here, until 2019, Kenya's governance architecture looked like this. It was one country governed by one government and through 8 administrative units called provinces. This happened until 2010. But after that, the promulgation of the new constitution created another, sort of revolutionized this governance architecture by creating all these other units which had more powers and more responsibilities than these provinces in the form of counties. So got from 8 provinces to 47 counties, from one government to 48 governments, because these counties are managed by governments, and these governments are not, they are devolved governments that are autonomous, and therefore the relationship between them and amongst them is cooperative rather than subordinate. And this is an interesting, it's been termed as one of the most radical and ambitious devolution or decentralization in the world. Now, this changed a lot of things, and in this case, the planning landscape, sort of where we had 2 levels of planning, and through one tier kind of a vertical relationship. And at the top level, we had the national. We do have the national level, and the lower level, subnational level at the counties. So the counties are the units of planning at the subnational level. And again, note that the relationship between them is cooperative, not subordinate. Now, this sort of created a multi-level and a polycentric governance system with the national level and the county levels cooperating at these 2 different levels. But note that even at the these counties, we have other lower levels, but these are essentially, fact or derivatives of counties. And then there is a cross-level dependence or interdependence, which you can see from this arrangement, but we will also highlight some of these later on. And this kind of arrangements created some social contracts and mandates, and defined the jurisdictions of each of these elements or each units. Now, without climate change, this is how the planning system would be the same one. But with the climate change now, the country adopted several climate relevant, climate specific plans, strategies, and laws. It has an updated nationally determined contribution, created a national adaptation plan 2015-2030, and a strategy which was this the national climate change response strategy was the first amongst the first climate focused frameworks in the country. And there are others, including the Act, the Law, Climate Change Act 2016. And I must note that this is one of the, so Kenya is one of the 2 other countries in Africa, I think, that have enacted a climate law. The other country, I think, being Benin. So you can see why Kenya is a front runner in a climate change response, and why I am excited to look at it as a case study. There are others, MCA 19, which is the Environmental Management and Coordination Act, which has been reviewed or amended to reflect the transition to this devolved system of governance, and other sector-specific laws and policies and plans. So at the level of county level, these levels, the counties implement all these pillars, the visions, the plans, strategies, and the laws at this level. And both at the national and the subnational, one strategy that has been employed by these levels to deal with climate change is what they are calling climate mainstreaming. Climate mainstreaming. So without climate change, all these CIDPs, special plans, and so on, so would have been implemented without considering climate change. But with climate change now, the strategy was to climate mainstream the implementation, design and implementation of all these other plans. But the counties also have specific laws and plans and policies which have been developed. Quite about 33 counties. The last time I checked, 33 counties had some form of climate change regulations and were establishing climate change funds in the country. Yeah, which is quite interesting to see how that happens. And the relationship between these two governments or levels of government is governed by a couple of laws, 3 of them which I highlight here, including the National Government Coordination Act 2013, which establishes an administrative and institutional framework for coordination of national government functions, both at the national level and at the county level, as well as the Intergovernmental Relations Act, which establishes a framework for consultation and cooperation between the national and the county governments and amongst the county governments themselves. The last one is the County Governmental Governments Act, which provides for the powers, functions, and responsibilities of county governments in the delivery of public service. So this is how climate action is to be structured and implemented. And if you want, you can visualize this as, Constitution of Kenya, the MCA Vision 2030, and all these other laws and acts and plans and strategies that emanate and are informed by the Constitution of Kenya. So anything that is done must fall within this framework. If anything that is unconstitutional will be challenged in court, as Kenyans seem to like contesting things that they think are unconstitutional. They have the freedom to go and contest this in court. Now, from a transboundary perspective, climate change, so you look at the counties I mentioned. All those counties, although they work and they are autonomous, independent, and do their own things, I looked at how many of these counties are within national borders, or they share borders with a national actor or other countries. Like here, you see this county, which is this is called Mandera County. Interesting enough, on this side it borders Somalia, and on this side borders Ethiopia. So it has 2 countries that border it, and only one county. This is one county called Wajir, which it borders. So this county here has more countries that border it than the subnational actors of counties. This one here, this is Turkana, has borders 3 countries: Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Uganda here, and it has a couple of subnational or county governments. So you will see that how they do their things will be dependent on where these particular counties are located. But the transboundary dynamics in this county, for instance, counties that are at the border level, at the border area, will have different dynamics as opposed to those ones that are more inland. And surprisingly, not unsurprisingly, sorry, these particular counties that are at the border seem to recognize more the transboundary dimensions of climate change than any others. But generally, we will say that transboundary climate risks are implicit, and the cross-border climate action is underdeveloped. Planning usually is done in isolation, and elements such as public participation, risk assessment, prioritization, impact assessment, monitoring and evaluation. All these are done within the borders of each county, and at the national level, the borders of each country. Now, as I have mentioned, that the transboundary dimensions are mostly recognized by these counties at the border areas. Not to mean that these counties that are in the interior are not affected, because of course, for instance, this county, if it's affected, the impact moves across or the borders of this county to other countries as people move, especially these counties here. These are counties that are more inhabited by pastoralist communities who move when conditions in their lands or in their areas are not favorable for their animals. Yeah, so yes, this is interesting in that sense that, you know, counties themselves seem to just be working independently, individually, but some do recognize the transboundary dimensions. And you know, one may say that the organization of governance in this way created a number of political economy aspects, and I highlight 4 of these, which are like: the first one is enclosure of resource and authority based on the mandates that each of these governments is given. The exclusion, which sort of defines who is involved and who should participate, and sort of marginalize or excludes anyone else who is not within the boundaries, the defined boundaries of each county or each country. Issues of encroachment of environment and jurisdiction of each other at the different levels is something that has been observed, and it was worse, especially in the initial years of implementing devolution. And there are also issues of entrenchment, worsening social inequality, and the ethnic identities which are sort of affirmed by these boundaries which have been defined and enclosed one community or ethnic communities in one area, and therefore feels a lot stronger. Identities are much stronger in those particular areas because they have their own county government, they have their own land or their own areas that they manage. Yeah, so, and this creates a couple of challenges for transboundary climate action, and these include the various special circumstances and needs that these particular counties find themselves, as well the geopolitics of it all, the costs of financing and doing financing, especially for cross-border initiatives, as well as capacity issues. Now, some of those counties have been marginalized for quite some time now. So, compared to others, they might have less capacity issues, or they might less or more capacity issues. The other dimension is that some of these counties have been dealing with these climate change challenges for a long time. So they have the institutional memory, they have developed tactics of dealing with it, but others haven't. There are also conventional actors and conventional actors in some of these areas, including so-called bandits, terrorists, and criminal groups like even cattle rustlers, who pose particular problems to some counties and not others. Talked about issues of equity, justice, and the various identities. There are also emergent risks which all these counties are dealing with, and a couple of last year, but one, we were dealing with desert locusts, which a phenomenon which had not been experiencing that magnitude. In the last time it was what, about 70 years ago. So you can see the counties themselves don't have any institutional memory of dealing with such particular risks. But there are opportunities. So 3 levels which I highlight. So the first is Council of Governors, where all the counties come together under one Council of Governors. Governors are the heads of, like the CEOs of the counties. They come together to sort of define the visions of these counties and protect them, if you will. protect their interest. But I also see the bilateral arrangements between counties as one opportunity, especially those counties that are bordering each other. But one of the most the areas I think there is a huge potential is through what is so-called regional economic blocks. So now, you know, when those counties came together, the counties came into existence, they looked around and said, well, we share a lot of history, we share a lot of culture, politics, and resources with these other counties. So why not come together and form these particular blocks? And there are about 8 of them now in the country. There are laws that are being now developed to create a framework for their functioning. And climate change is one of those things that are highlighted as a motivation for bringing themselves together to deal with the problems. Some of the counties are in more than one of these blocks, which is you know, understandable because of the borders they share. Like, for instance, this county here is both in this, you will see it borders counties in this FCDC, the Frontier Counties Development Council, as well as the Southeastern Kenya Economic Bloc. Now, this little bit boy here is Nairobi. Nairobi is the capital of Kenya and is not in any bloc yet that I know of, and there are reasons for that. Some of which are, like, you know, is the seat of the country. So yeah, and it would have a lot of competitive advantage or competitive edge compared to all other counties. So in summary, what am I saying? As we continue doing our work, whether you're in the policy or the practice level or research, we need to mind the borders. And these borders are not just the political boundaries. We need to rethink the boundaries, our disciplinary boundaries, institutional boundaries, and so on and so forth. And I hope I have convinced you that transboundary climate risks are a real threat to resilience building, and that you know, not bearing them in mind might end up transferring risk or redistributing risk and vulnerability across the various boundaries. And when I talk about the transboundary or the climate risks, I mean both the ones that can affect us and the ones that we can export or transfer to other places. They need consideration. And yeah, so the other 3-4 things is, when you need to engage, we need to engage beyond our silos. These are maybe disciplinary silos or institutional silos or countries. You know, we need to go beyond that, because that's the nature of our world, and this the nature of the climate risks. And when we do whatever we do, we need to do it well, because even good things can have bad impacts to others. The second last thing is, we need to document and share stories and experiences to bring attention to how the propagation of these particular risks, and to bring insights from other boundaries, from other areas, from other disciplines that could inform a more holistic and coherent kind of action. And finally, as we have highlighted, choices have consequences. So we need to be mindful of that. Choices have consequences, and even choices to do good things can have consequences to our immediate neighbors or to people that are distant. And ladies and gentlemen, that marks the end of my talk now. Asanteni sana, thank you very much. And I think we now have about 15 or so minutes of Q&A. Over to you, Eva.
Yes. Hi, Martin. Thank you so much for your brilliant presentation and for speaking about the transboundary climate action, especially in your home country context, which is Kenya. I found it very interesting to learn about the changes post 2010 in
Yes.
The different counties that were established, and also how your explanation about the laws and national plans around climate change response. It was really good to know that Kenya is one of the 2 countries that is following and implementing a plan or a law around climate change response. Thank you so much for shedding light on that. We do have quite a few interesting questions that have come through in advance from our attendees. So I would like to start from there. But I'd also like to let the attendees know that we will spend a couple of more minutes now in the Q&A session. Please take this opportunity to send in your questions via the chat box. If you're comfortable, you can also unmute yourself when you're called out. But for now, let's start with question one. If you are ready, Martin.
Yes, I am. Can I stop sharing the screen now?
I think we can just leave the slide there for now. Okay. Unless you want to stop sharing and just have your video on.
Yeah, there's some people who want to look at each other. Yes. I would like to also see who is here. Right, brilliant.
Great. So starting with the first question is, can transboundary climate risk be managed through other existing practices, such as a sustainable supply chain through which transboundary commodities are exchanged through export and imports?
Yeah, okay, yes. The short answer is yes, they can. And in fact, the production and consumption of goods and services are increasingly interconnected through the complex global chains of supply, or supply chains as they are called. And the greenhouse gas emissions associated with them are thus interlinked. So climate risk can be either mitigated by greening the supply chains themselves. Also, the impacts of climate change in one node of such a networked supply chains can be propagated and felt in both near and distant places, as we have said. Therefore, sustainably, managing or sustainable supply chains and their conscious management is a good pathway for transboundary climate risk management.
Thank you for a brilliant response, Martin. The next question is around military and police. Military and police form multiple transnational networks. What is the role of security leaders in managing climate change, and how can they best be mobilized to support effective transnational management?
Thanks, Eva. That's an interesting question, and it's a question that really calls for crossing boundaries of how we do things. So just not operating with one domain alone. And it is now acknowledged that climate change is not merely an environmental problem, and it is more and more regarded as a security problem, a threat to peace and international security. And there have been increasing observations as well as speculations that climate change may increase the risk of violent conflicts and insecurity, especially as people move from one place to another, and the conflicts related to resources such as land, water, and other natural resources. And this has been recognized and has been incorporated in the UN agenda, including the UN Security Council, some countries are already thinking about, while others are reviewing their security strategies to incorporate climate risks. So this is already happening. What I think is that we can harness the strategic influence and funding and resourcing of the security dockets. In many countries, these are the ones that are quite funded. We can harness this potential towards effective transnational cooperation and management of climate-related risks.
Great, thank you. So the next question is from the chat box by Hirak. I hope I'm pronouncing the name correctly. And their question is, do you think announcing strict lockdown is better than drafting vague agreement towards climate action boundary apart?
So lockdowns for what? Lockdowns?
We can ask Hirak to be more specific with their question.
Oh, okay,
in
okay.
the chat
Is
box. But
oh,
I'm
it's in the
happy
chat
to,
box. Okay.
yes, it's in the chat box, but I'm happy to take the next question and we can come back to that question.
Okay.
Yeah. So I've seen a hand raised. Salome, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Thank you. I'm Kenyan, first of all. So I think I was relating to this presentation, but speaking of the interventions, particularly now at devolved levels, I'm just asking to find out if there's any data on the extent of citizen involvement in climate change adaptation and mitigation. Because you may have realized, the presenter may have realized that the last, shall I say 20 years, we've had very, quite orchestrated climate events in Kenya. And on many occasions, you realize that citizens, first of all, don't even know what's happening. And then therefore it means they don't know what to do about, even for immediate reactions or actions to take. Unlike in the past, where we had traditional knowledge on event predictions, and at the same time, traditional knowledge on circumventing any immediate risks. Yeah,
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So Eva, am I looking at that, or are we getting another question before that, or I can answer this?
We are happy to respond to
Okay,
Salome's
good,
question
good.
for now, and then we'll look at Hirok's
Right.
question.
Okay. Yeah. You're absolutely right, Salome, and you know, as I mentioned earlier, you know, citizen participation in Kenya was sort of configured. It was revolutionized, if you will, by the devolved system of governance and the new constitution, which put it at the core of governance, unlike the previous arrangement before, where citizen participation was sort of, you know, an optional thing. Right now, you can stop an initiative based on, and many of them have been stopped based on inadequate citizen participation. I agree with you that, and this has been raised as a challenge, that not many people, the ordinary citizens, understand why things are happening the way they are happening. And this was highlighted a couple of months ago in the Devolution Conference, which was whose theme was multi-level governance for climate action. That the people, the citizens at the local level, do not really adequately understand what is causing all these happenings in their local context. Some of them think either they have sinned a lot and they need to pray more. Others need that it is the ancestors that are sad, or God is unhappy, and so on and so forth. And therefore, their participation is really, as you rightly put it, is not very informed. And I think it is, and there isn't. I don't think there is any, I haven't seen any data which talks about citizen participation, but one proxy you can use to sort of look at their participation is how much citizens participate in the development of the CIDPs, the County Integrated Development Plans, and how much they participate as well in their design, but also as well as in the accountability mechanisms that are put there in place, as well as implementing and evaluating the projects, climate change projects that have been implemented. Thank you. I hope that says something to you, Salome.
Not yet. Not yet.
Yeah, she has a follow-up question. Yeah, you can go ahead, Salome.
I find this presentation reproducible. It can be adopted in different regions, but of particular significance is we in Kenya, just to speak of Kenya, because it's as far as I know much, we introduced recently a new system of education, the CBC. And CBC is basically like taking us back to hands-on life that we used to lead before maybe you were born. I don't know. I'm sorry, but now I'm looking at if there's any intention to integrate what we have on the policy tables for climate action at different levels, particularly at a higher sectoral levels, name county governance or national governance, and what we do in schools. Because incorporating these in schools at early age, in my opinion, could be a way of reducing costs of doing the same thing.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, I think there have been arguments around that, and I can't quite remember, but I think about 1 or 2 years ago, there were the ministry. I think the Ministry of Environment came up with the so-called climate change curriculum guidelines, which were to sort of integrate the climate change within our curriculum. And I think this is in line with the Paris Agreement's goals, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals, which look at awareness and education as part of the essential elements in response to climate change. So yes, I think it's important to incorporate and integrate these things because, as I highlighted before, intergenerational climate change is an intergenerational issue, and if we are creating a new generation or these generations of leaders that we are building in schools, they need also to understand that this is a problem that is not going away today, and they need to understand the nature of this problem. So I totally agree that it is essential to bring the climate change issues within our curriculum, and I think there are already some steps, although I haven't seen it in action, and it might be an issue of capacity, but I haven't seen a lot of it being done, but there is a talk, and there are some guidelines which the ministry has already developed. I think I can't, I think it's 2020 or 2021, I can't remember when, but I can check those out and share those particular guidelines so that you can see how they provide. And the other thing which I will mention related to that is so within the same Ministry of Environment, which is the focal ministry for climate related stuff, developed something similar. So from these guidelines, it developed what it called the climate change learning strategy. I think it's a 10-year I think, and was launched last year as well, I think. So you can look at that and see. I'll see if I have it in my files and upload it here before this ends. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin, for your response. I'm aware we've almost reached the time of ending the webinar. However, there are quite a few interesting questions in the chat box, so I would like to, touch upon 2 or 3 questions. So Martin, if you have the time, if we can, just look at 2 or 3 questions more. And for attendees who have to leave because of time constraints, I would like to thank you for attending this webinar. But if you can wait for a few more minutes for this very interactive question answer session, please feel free to continue in this conversation. Martin, are you okay to take 2 or 3 more questions?
Yes, I can.
All right. So very quickly, we have a question from William, who's asked, would you please highlight on the level of awareness among the different ethnic, I suppose they mean tribes, ethnic tribes, and has there been any effort to engage in the neighboring countries?
The level of awareness of climate change amongst the different ethnic groups is varied. as I mentioned earlier, there are some of those ethnic communities that have had a long history of dealing with the droughts and famine, and you would see that they have developed particular coping mechanisms. But those ethnic groups and communities in the so-called resilient counties or resilient regions are finding themselves in uncharted territories as they have to deal with issues or things that they are not very aware, or they haven't developed the systems, or they are even, as Salome mentioned, their indigenous systems of knowledge have not been used to dealing with. So yes, the level of awareness of climate issues or climate related or so-called weather related issues varies across the different ethnic groups and based on their socioeconomic activities, pastoralist versus agriculturalist versus those who are in service counties. Have there been efforts for transboundary action between counties? I will say ish, because I remember when I was in the field a couple of months ago, one of them told me that they have tried to do this, to develop common projects, to even try and access funds from the Green Climate Fund. But the collaboration has been impeded by lack of funds, because you need funds to bring stakeholders together in different counties to discuss these issues. And there are no resources that have been set aside for these nexus projects or cross-border projects. So I think that is it's a very good question, but there are gaps for that. There is a lot of talk. There is a bit of recognition of the transboundary dimensions of these particular risks. When one county or for instance, pastoralist communities move into an agricultural area, they have different value systems, and therefore the animals go eat the agricultural crops of the other, and then that's the only way one of the common ways you see people coming together to say yes, yeah, this is an issue that we need to bring the communities of these two counties together. But in terms of planning and in terms of deliberate planning and implementing of these projects, they are rare, especially under climate change action. Through other fields like conflict management, security management, you might have some of those initiatives, and within the region there are a couple of some of those initiatives that have been heralded not only by the national government but also by the regional organizations such as IGAD and Intergovernmental Authority on Development.
Great, thank you, Martin. Going back to the question which I raised earlier by Hira about lockdown, if you remember. So yes. They have now specified they meant lockdown, the COVID-19 lockdown. So do you think announcing a strict COVID-19 lockdown is better than drafting a vague agreement towards climate action or boundary?
So those are two different. The nature of those two problems is different. So climate change is one of those, the so-called wicked problems, whereby you can't have one solution to solve them all. But for instance, the pandemic, COVID-19, we know all you need to do is stop the transmission of these particular viruses, and you are good to go. But you can't have a lockdown for climate change, because it doesn't respect those boundaries. If there is a flood, you can't have a lockdown for floods. If there is a drought, you can't have a lockdown for flood. But I think what the person sort of is saying is having like safeguards, which translate to concrete kind of actions. And I agree with you, with them, that having a concrete action is important. But how these concrete actions, the nature of these concrete actions will vary from one country to another, one community to another because the contexts differ. The climate impacts have different effects on different people, on different communities, on different ecosystems. So you can't have a one, one size fits all kind of an approach to climate change. That's why the agreements we have are quite big on context specific nature of response.
Brilliant. With this, I will have to now end the Q&A session. Having said that, there are quite a few interesting questions in the chat box. Because of the time, we will have to unfortunately end this webinar now. But Martin, I would like to let you know there are quite a good list of questions, and attendees have also shared their email addresses to network and collaborate with you. So please have a look in the chat box. If once you have the time, I'm also happy to share them with you. So thank you to all the attendees who have joined us today. Apologies once again for ending the webinar. It has been quite an interactive session, and I'm sure Martin would agree with that as well. And there have been quite a few encouraging, appreciative messages in the chat box about how brilliant and wonderful your webinar presentation was. Once again, this webinar has been recorded, so we will be sharing the recording on CSE's YouTube channel. Martin has also shared his email address, so please get in touch with Martin via his email address and also via LinkedIn if you would like to connect with him for further discussions in terms of knowing more about his research work or networking. If you are in a similar field, or just to know more about his work, please do connect with Martin via email or via LinkedIn. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and thank you so much, Martin, for the wonderful presentation. I'm sure some of us, I'm sure the attendees would agree that it has been eye-opening, and for me personally, it was really great to know so many things about Kenya and transboundary aspects and climate action, and what the different dynamics are within the different counties, especially when it comes to addressing climate change action. So thank you for highlighting that with us. Any last words before we end the webinar?
No, just to appreciate and say thank you very much for inviting me to speak about this subject, and thanking everybody who has tuned in to listen. And the questions have been fantastic. I will have a look at some of these questions, and time permitting, we might develop like short answers for those, and share either with a specific person that has asked, or just to share them on the various platforms of the CSE. But thank you very much for this. Let's keep engaging, and let's do the good and do it well. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Martin. We will be sharing the CSE YouTube recording on the CSE's Knowledge Hub, especially on the Strengthening Resilience and Response to Crisis Hub. If you are not a member of the hubs yet, please do check it out. And Martin is happy to continue conversations within the hub, as well as it is one platform for everyone to connect and network and discuss this webinar further. So do take this opportunity when the recording is shared in the hub. Thank you, Martin, and thank you everyone for attending. I hope you all have a good rest of the evening or day from wherever you're joining us. Have a great time, everyone. Thank you. See you.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye. Bye, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.